Hello, this is Ethica America, where we check in to see how America is doing. We are your hosts, Aaron and
Oh, I'm.
uh, who are you?
I forgot. Shit.
Hi, Ryan.
Oh, that's right. I'm Kyle.
And this is part two of the news. Last week we talked about how government kind of using the news to push their own agenda for World War One, and the Germans were using radio to kind of get everyone on board for their agenda, and then England was using that radio to get people onto their agenda and kind of pushing that propaganda to fight the Germans and babies and bayonets.
Right, right. And I mean, they weren't just using radio. A lot of that was just being, over newspaper. I mean, Germany did have one of the most, well, I should say one of the first. I think it's actually the longest, if I remember right, the longest established radio tower. I don't know if you can call it a tower, but I don't know the right word. But regardless, they have one of the longest radio transmissions coming from what they used during World War One. I got to look that up real quick because I had to throw it. I had to dump everything out of my brain from part one of this episode to fill it up with part two of this episode.
Right.
And I'm still just confused. So,
yeah, I mean, part one was basically just an overview of like why the government controlling their own news is not always a great idea.
no.
It kind of leads to this control the government pushing their own propaganda and this own idea, and it being biased.
Right,
And
right.
we kind of see that. I mean, we kind of see that nowadays too with our news channel stations on TV.
Oh, for sure, man. I mean, it doesn't help that like during World War One, Woodrow Wilson enacted the Espionage Act of 1917, which was a law that was passed shortly after the U.S. Entered World War One that criminalized various forms of dissent and provided penalties for actions deemed harmful to the war effort. Right, so like you're speaking bad about the war. That's not allowed. Like the government has put this down, and this surprisingly, like for during World War One, like cases went to the Supreme Court for this and for the Sedition Act, which I'll get into in a minute. But cases went to the Supreme Court about this. Particularly a labor union or a couple of labor unions that were acting in the name of communism over here, not acting for skilled laborers, but just acting for every laborer, right? And keep in mind, they were definitely like communist style labor unions, right? But then again, all labor unions are kind of communist style labor unions where they're like, hey, you can only make this much if you've only been here for like 3 years. Your starting wage is your starting wage based on your previous experience and whatever we were hiring for the position. But they're very regimented, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
But these cases went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court initially was like, no, we uphold it. Like, this was a time of war. And during times of war, we do need to be able to censor the media a little bit and keep a positive image for American morale.
Right. If we don't have that positive morale, then we kind of get into that Vietnam of like, should we really be over here? And we really shouldn't have been over there.
Yeah. But then, like, I think it was like 4 years later or something like that, the Supreme Court was like, no, yeah, we shouldn't have done that. It's like, what? Like, it's the same judges, the one who gave like this very clear response in the beginning. And then the next time he's like, no. When it comes to national security, I make it akin to yelling fire in a movie theater. If somebody needs to yell fire in a movie theater, they should be allowed to yell fire in a movie theater. But if somebody's yelling fire in a movie theater when there's no fire, then there need to be actions for those,
right,
or consequences for that, rather. So
we saw a lot of anti-war in World War II, though. I mean, that's where like all the flower power and all that kind of hippie mumbo jumbo stuff kind of came around, but I think we probably had that around in World War One as well. I just don't
Yeah, I
remember
don't
seeing a
know.
lot of that.
I think the hippie stuff was largely more after the Korean War and
Oh
during the
yeah,
Vietnam
probably.
War.
Yeah.
Because I don't remember the exact dates, but the Korean War was like what 53 to 57, maybe.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I don't really
Yeah,
see any. I don't remember seeing any like anti-war for World War II.
yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, and there wasn't a whole lot. I mean, keep in mind though, World War II, entirely different scenario. So like Japanese
Right.
like bomb Pearl Harbor, and it's like, okay, that's a direct attack on U.S. soil.
Yeah, but we
So,
also probably should have entered World War II a little bit earlier than that. But we also, I guess, I don't know. I guess it depends on
well,
how much information we actually have from what the Germans were actually doing. But
I mean, you got to keep in mind though too. I mean, there's good documentation on wartime and stuff
mhm.
like that, and the reasons that we get involved and all that stuff. But like, it seems like, well, so keep in mind that America was established in 1776. We're a relatively new country, and we're just kind of getting used to the idea of war, I guess,
Mhm.
even though we have one like every 30 years or so. Like, I don't understand that, but that's for another episode. It's
Kind of
like,
is.
yeah, well, I mean, like,
Like, when should we interject in wars and when should we not? And it's a touchy subject. And a lot of times, maybe we should have entered in and helped people. And other times, it's like, maybe we should not have done that.
well, yeah, and I mean, it's six in one hand, half a dozen in another. I
Right.
mean,
It's all in hindsight where you're like, maybe that wasn't a good idea. But
yeah. I mean, I still say hindsight is 50-50.
yeah,
And I don't mean 2020. I
no,
mean 50-50. Yeah.
2020. I
Yeah.
mean, that's just good vision.
Yeah, well. Well, I think that's probably why they say hindsight is 2020.
Yeah,
I just say it's
probably.
50-50 because like history's always biased.
It
So,
is.
yeah.
It kind of just depends on the news.
Well, yeah, I mean the victors write the stories, right? I
They do.
mean, and I mean every country is prone to, I don't want to say edit the history books, but lean towards history books that put them in a more favorable light, I guess, especially when your government controls your education system. That makes sense.
I mean, if the government's in control of your news media and also your history books and what you're reading, it kind of sounds like a communism.
But we're not going to get into communism. We already established this far before this podcast started. That is a whole can of worms that I've been
It is.
researching for a week. That we're not
Just
getting
like
into communism.
right, we're not going to
But
communism. Man,
well,
not
actually,
today.
well,
We might touch on it. I don't know.
we definitely will touch on it because that's about where I was going to go with this
Yeah.
Espionage Act of 1917.
Right.
So Espionage Act of 1917 criminalized various forms of dissent and provided penalties for actions deemed harmful to the war effort. But it targeted acts as espionage, sabotage, and obstructing recruitment or enlistment in the military. So like you're interfering with that, like Uncle Sam's going to have a word basically. And it was used to prosecute individuals who opposed the war or expressed anti-government sentiments, right?
Mhm.
So, I mean, it's very vague terminology, I guess is all I'm going to say. And we'll get into that here in a little bit. But then the following year, the Sedition Act of 1918 was passed, right? And also the Immigration Act of 1918, but we're going to cover the Sedition Act first. So the Sedition Act of 1918 amended the Espionage Act, so it added on to it and expanded the scope of punishable offenses. So it criminalized any expression or publication of disloyal, profane, or abusive language against the government, the flag, or the military. And then the Immigration Act of 1918 provided the basis for deporting individuals suspected of radical political beliefs or affiliations. And it authorized the expulsion of non-citizens who were considered anarchists, communists, or otherwise advocating for the overthrow of the government.
So the government was saying, we have to have this war, and any anti-war talk is banned because we need people to think war is good, so people will enlist in the war so they can fight for the war.
But you have free speech, buddy.
Yeah, kinda. We kind of have free speech as long as it doesn't say anything about anti-war.
Yeah. Or anything negative about the government, right?
Yeah.
And as long as you're not a
boy.
communist, because like this was used a lot, like, so, God, I gotta look up a name real quick.
Oh man, is this law still in effect? Are we all gonna go to like prison because we're talking about anti-government because we're socialists or something?
One of them is actually. I can't remember if it's the Sedition Act. I think it's the Sedition Act that's still in place. No. Let me find my tab. I think it's the Sedition Act. Is Sedition Act still in effect?
And that's the one where you can't talk about anti-war stuff, right?
Well, I mean, they're both about that, but the Sedition Act specifically has more to do with any expression or publication of disloyal, profane, or abusive language against the government, particularly during times of war.
Okay.
And no, that one's not the one that's in effect. The one that's still in effect is the initial one. Which is the Espionage Act. That was actually used not too long ago.
So I couldn't imagine like that, the Sedition Act still being in effect, just because we have so much of anti-war in everything.
Right.
I mean, when we were over there in for that war against weapons of mass destruction, we just had so much anti-war, so they couldn't really enforce that.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, the Espionage Act was used to that was used in conjunction with the Immigration Act. So like so I guess we should touch on this. So probably right after sorry, I'm drawing a blank. It largely took place right after World War One, but it had started during World War One, right? But anybody who pledged loyalty or was affiliated with the Communist Party of Russia, right?
Oh yeah,
they would just get exported.
Yeah,
expedited back to the country you go. So, and it's weird because we actually fought alongside Russia, right? But we have a lot of deep-seated hatred for Russia because they just have never really aligned with our viewpoint, at least historically. Though in the 90s there seemed to be hope, and then that's a completely different topic for a completely different day, but I could talk to you about it for hours. So after these laws were passed, these acts, right?
Yeah.
The Attorney General, there was a radical who he bombed a bunch of, or attempted to bomb a bunch of places of basically where prominent members of Congress or government parties resided, right? One of which being Attorney General Mitchell Palmer, right? And he wasn't injured. If I remember right, his nanny or his housekeeper was injured, right? Mm-hmm. And he just became pissed, which, I mean, somebody puts a bomb in my house, I'm going to find them and I'm probably going to kill them. So like the fact that like he just went kind of ape shit and decided to start these Palmer raids, right? I get it. But like somebody should have realized that the guy was probably a little bit biased, considering that he himself was, you know, the a person who had been targeted by these I'll just call them terrorist groups, but really it's just by people who didn't necessarily agree with what the U.S. was doing.
Mhm.
So you can call them a lot of them like the worst part is like right after World War One, like it was the first Red Scare, right? And they seemed
Yeah.
to target a lot of Italian Americans, which is I thought was kind of weird. But then I thought back to Benito Mussolini, right? And then I thought back to the fact that like he was friends with Francisco Franco, right? I think he was leader of Spain at one point. Um, but Mussolini being the fascist dictator for at least part of World War II, right? Like it's not so. How do I want to put it? I guess it's not so illogical to go after Italian Americans if you know what's going on overseas, maybe. But this guy, General Mitchell Palmer, he started the what's known as the Palmer Raids. And the Palmer Raids were a series of government-led actions in 1919 and 1920 to arrest and deport suspected radical individuals, right? So like nowadays, I mean, you can kind of think of like how we treated Muslims right after
Right. Or how
right
we
after
treated
9/11.
Japanese
Oh,
during
right.
the World War II.
Oh, well, I mean, maybe they deserve to go to intern. They didn't deserve to go to internment camps. I'm not going there. Like,
No.
man, like, and the worst part is we had such a good relationship with Japan before like World War II. It's really weird how that changed. And then right afterwards, it's like nothing happened. It's like totally bizarre. But I suppose that's what happens when you militarily occupy a country for however many years.
Right.
So,
And we still
whatever.
have like Asian hate going on in America too.
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, we're not putting anybody in like internment camps,
No,
but I
no.
remember during COVID, like, I remember during COVID, somebody spitting on the plexiglass at my local Chinese restaurant and then like just swearing at like the woman behind the counter. And she just looked unfazed. But it like, had he tried to come behind the counter, like, I'm sure she would have grabbed a butcher knife and like slaughtered his ass. Like, yeah.
It's so weird how that how this portrayal during times of like hecticness and crisis, like the pandemic or war, that we just have this weird viewpoint of people that are part of that. Like,
I have enjoyed
demographic.
P.F. Chang's all through the 90s and all through the 2000s, but this decade, I think the Chinese. It's like, what the hell, man? Like, come
Yeah.
on. Like I'm not saying that like communism's like this absolutely great system or anything like
Mhm.
that, but like most of the people living under a communist regime, like they're just people.
Yeah.
They're just as chill as you and me. They just want to go about their day-to-day life. Like the only reason to really be involved with any sort of government in general, right, is just because the government offers you some sort of benefit, whether that benefit is protection or social aid, such as like, you know, Medicare or whatever. That's the only reason to allow yourself to be controlled by a government, really, when you think about it. Like that's like, can you imagine the first governments, which once again, another topic for another day, but like the first governments, like, you know, you probably had this guy who's like, oh no, I'll protect you from the wolves or I'll protect you from the fire. Don't
Mhm.
worry about it. And it was probably the guy who was controlling the wolves and the fire. Like,
Possibly.
yeah. Like, I don't know. But anyhow, like that, there's only so many reasons that like you'd want to be part of a government. And that's usually for some sort of benefit for yourself. So, you know, instead of the John F. Kennedy, don't ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That's kind of a bullshit statement because that never would have gotten like anybody going, like, you know, in caveman times.
No.
Yeah.
It is a weird. It was probably a good statement then to kind of push whatever agenda they wanted to push, but when you really think about it, it's like, no, what can the government do for me? Because like me giving up all my rights and stuff for a country is not in my best interest.
Right. And like, don't get me wrong. I think if there was no government, by the way, and I'm certainly not proposing anything like that, but I think if there was no government, most people would just want to get on with their day-to-day activities.
Yeah.
That's it. They just want to go to work. They just want to, you know, pay for the house that they have a mortgage on. And that's it.
Yep.
It's that simple. Most people are chill.
Yeah. People just want to eat, sleep, and be happy.
Sometimes people want to shit, though.
Oh yeah, maybe.
I don't know. I've met some weird people.
That makes them happy.
Sometimes. So anyhow, back to these Palmer raids. So like thousands of people, including immigrants and U.S. citizens, were targeted from these raids, right? And they would have like very little evidence, right? And they would just barge into people's houses and be like, "You're under arrest under the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act for speaking bad about the government." And then they'd be like, "But I'm a Bible thumping Christian."
And when they say, "No, you're a communist," get in the van.
The van. Well, I don't think they had vans, but yeah, I mean, they would probably just go because like a bunch of guys with guns, that seems like a bad time. So especially if you don't have one.
Yeah.
So I mean, and I'm sure that like it started out well intended, but when you put somebody like General Palmer or Attorney General Palmer in a position of power after he himself just had his house bombed, do you not think that he's going to rain down holy hell? Like, that was just a bad idea. So, I mean, whatever. But the raids were characterized by widespread violations of civil liberties, with many individuals detained, and there was a lot of this happening without due process. Now, eventually, like I said, the Sedition Act was repealed, and a lot of these guys kind of got amnesty, right? But it's like they still spent 4 years in prison or 4 years detained or whatever. You know, it's like that's not right at all, man.
No.
So, I mean, that sounds like a bad time.
And was the government at the time pushing this as a good thing that they're doing in the news?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Like, I mean, like they were like, "Oh, we're catching all these communists and doing all this," but like after World War I was over and like a year had subsided, people kind of got the vibe that like they were being manipulated in some way. And there was this big disdain for like the government on these issues, man. Like there was this big pushback, like as I mentioned in the last episode, the CPI, which is the what is it called? CPI acronym 1920.
Children Protecting Investors.
It's definitely not them. Oh, the Committee on Public Information, right?
Oh, man,
so they started. Yeah, you were definitely not right. but like, so they Edward Bernays worked for them, which we'll touch on here. But once again, that's a conversation for another day. It really sucks how much these things are just so intertwined that you need such an understanding of what happened here and there to be able to put everything into perspective. Like everything just kind of funnels down to like, well, really World War II, and then it kind of cools off for a little bit, and then it gets heated again. But so the Committee on Public Information, as I mentioned last time, they were basically our government's propaganda department that we had spurred off of Great Britain's, right? And like they were putting a bunch of information out there about how, Russia's real bad, how just a bunch of like propaganda out there. Like that was their job, was to spin the story and like get public sympathy going towards the government. You know what I'm saying? Like their job was to manipulate everybody, and eventually everybody caught on and they're like, yeah, dude, like we won't be part of that again. Like, no, like they had such an unfavorable opinion that like it was the Committee on Public Information was actually dissolved in 1919 because like everybody just hated them. They hated how they were manipulated. Right. And then in the meantime, you have a bunch of white and black soldiers who fought together in World War I, and they thought they were going to come back as equals because over there, like, they're going life or death, like, saving each other, fighting side by side and all that. And then they come back, and then all of a sudden it's like, I don't want anything to do with you. It's like, what the fuck, man? Like,
I know. And then we had
it's like
the whole racism thing going on from...
Well, like...
for years. Like we
Oh,
didn't finish
yeah,
segregation until like the 60s or 70s.
had to have been the 70s, dude. So in 1920, as an example, there was a black community that was burned down, and like just called Greenwood, right? Also known as Black Wall Street, one of the wealthiest black communities in the United States,
Mhm.
right? And like as a result of this attack, which was like, I think it was some farmer, right? It was near Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I think it was some farmer who had a plane who was just dropping like fire bombs and shit on them, right? And it was a bunch of like white people who like this was a black community that like black people had migrated to because they're like, okay, this is a prosperous community. We can work with each other. You know, there's no hatred here and all that stuff, right? And as a result of the attack, like, I think it left, yeah, okay. So it left 10,000 people homeless. It destroyed 190 businesses. 35 blocks were systematically looted and burned. Like, it was fucked up, dude. Like, so while everybody's talking about the Roaring Twenties, right? It wasn't roaring for everybody, or maybe
No.
it was just roaring, but roaring in an entirely different fashion.
Yeah.
And the media didn't report on that very much because, like I said, like white America did not care. Like it was, they got back from war and then they just parted ways, and then things just went back to the same way that it had been. Like it's really kind of fucked up, dude. But
Right. And segregation, the acts didn't, the segregation's acts happened in 64, I think, so mid 60s. But I mean, all that stuff still happened after the 60s and even till today. Like all that stuff's
right.
still prevalent.
Well,
Just
and I mean, you
because the
think about
government,
it,
yeah, I mean, just because the government says something doesn't change everyone's mind on it.
right? And I mean, the abolition of slavery. I mean, like, what was it? The Civil War ended in 1865, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, the idea was that they would just walk amongst us as equals, right? That was their idea at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like, some guy in a southern plantation who, like, so keep in mind that, like, the Confederate dollar, right? At the end, like, the Confederacy started their own monetary system, but it got hyperinflated. And at the end of the Civil War, like during the last months, it was worth 2 cents to a federal dollar.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. So, and then a month after that, like it was still used a little bit as far as currency goes, but it was pretty much worthless. Like the paper it was printed on was more valuable at that point. So, like, it's it left a lot of people in the South very poor, which that kind of sucks. So, like, there's a lot of events there, but as a result of abolition of slavery, they just kind of took it their own way, where they were like, okay, well, whatever. But just because you're not a slave anymore doesn't mean that I have to treat you as an equal, which is completely bullshit.
Right, exactly. That's a lot of what that mentality was. Is just because the government says you're equal doesn't mean you're equal in my eyes.
Yeah, but you see a lot of that after World War I too. So
Yeah,
it's like, just because I fought alongside you doesn't mean that we're the same now.
Right.
And it's like, that's just kind of a shitty mentality to have.
It is.
But like moving forward from that, in the 1920s, right? Starting at the very beginning of the 1920s, 1921, only 1% of homes had a radio. But that number grew to 75% by 1932. Public media really started growing during this time. In the 1920s, media really began to change, right? So Edward Bernays, who, as I mentioned, was working with the CPI, he's the founder, or he's attributed to being the founder of PR, right? Public relations, right? He basically invented the field, right? He starts doing advertising, right? Now, before this, your advertising was traditionally people doing things like patent medicines. Like, do you know anything about patent medicines, by the way?
You have a patent on a medicine, and then you have that for a while, and then eventually it can become a generic. But the pharmaceutical
No,
people can update it.
that's That's not what a patent medicine. Maybe that's what a modern patent medicine is, right?
Hmm.
But did you ever see Sweeney Todd?
Yes.
You ever see the kid who's like, buy Pirelli's miracle elixir, it'll do everything?
Oh, that, yeah.
That's patent medicine. So basically you come up with this like liquid or pill or whatever, right?
Snake oil.
And then you're just like, yeah, it's exactly snake oil. Yeah.
I was thinking of a different patent.
Yeah, well, I mean, like that changed when the FDA kind of started, but for the most part, and that was like the early 1900s. But for the most part, that's how all ads were, though. Like, you would get an ad for, we'll just say, a radio, right? And it'll be like, it'll completely transform your life. No, you don't need electricity. And that's a bad example. I mean,
Is it because there's transformers in a radio and it's going to transform your life?
oh, I like that. No, I wonder if that was ever used because that was pretty good. Because I mean, yeah, that was one of the first like electrical step down things. So, God,
If they didn't use that, that's a missed opportunity.
That's a travesty. Yeah, that was really good. Did you just improv that?
I did. Everything
Excellent
I do is
work.
improv. I don't do research.
Yeah, neither do I.
I just use ChatGPT and it tells me everything I need to know.
Yeah, well, I mean, this episode, that's about how that's going. So, no, but like, so people started receiving their media in a new way, I guess is all I'm trying to say. And with 75% of people owning like a radio, and this is at the dawn of the Great Depression, right? That 75% of people, which that's just weird to me. Like,
Yeah, how do they get a radio?
yeah,
They can't even go to they can't even go to Oregon. How can they get a radio?
I have no idea. Like this, that's something else that I got to look into at some point. But like I said, I'm a little bit sporadic today.
Wasn't everyone going west during the Great Depression to try and like find jobs and
Yeah.
money? Which is basically just the Oregon Trail, but
a little bit easier.
yeah, and also
No
more
dysentery this time around.
No.
And if there is dysentery, thank God that Mr. Fleming or Dr. Fleming invented the antibiotic. Well, actually, that was during World War II that he invented it, so it wasn't quite yet.
And good thing we have all that mercury for people to use.
Yeah. Pirelli's Miracle Elixir is, you can find the link in the doobly-doo. Just 15% off if you use the code fuck you.
Whoa, that's a good code. Modern news, though.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was just going to go back to. So throughout the 1920s, it was a bunch of this yellow journalism, right? Which was just a bunch of eccentric claims and a bunch of sensationalism, right? So basically, like it's a lot like clickbait.
Right.
You read these sensational headlines and you're like, oh, I got to know more, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why is radio becoming so popular? I don't know anything about this. Like, why is radio becoming the number one source of music now? Like, I liked my vinyl record player, like, or whatever, but they just, top 10 tips for your whatever. Like, yellow journalism has been around for a long time, and it's just recently started to pop up again, right?
And what is yellow journalism?
I mean, it's really just sensationalism more than anything else. So the idea of like that you can sell more newspapers, by the way, by just being a little bit exciteful or eccentric, right?
Why do they call it yellow journalism? Why the term yellow?
Well, and that's what I looked up too, right? Because I thought originally it had to do with an Asian culture, right? But it is not. Give me a sec. I forget, but it has to do with the New York Times and somebody else, or maybe it was the New York Post.
Hogan's Ally.
Yeah, Hogan's Alley. Yeah.
The comic strip featured a character called the Yellow Kid.
The Yellow Kid. And he wore a yellow nightshirt, and the comic strip itself was published in yellow ink.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But I originally thought, like, Um, I originally thought, like in the 1800s, they would call Asian people yeller. And that's what I thought was like, oh, yellow journalism. Okay, so it's just racism again.
Yeah.
Right. But no, not so much. So, but it appeared prominently in two New York newspapers, the New York World and the New York Journal. So I was wrong about the New York Times.
There's so many New York things, so it's understandable.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's the New York Post too. But that's the thing is that like eventually all of these like mass media ownership just gets really weird. So
I don't understand. Well, I don't know why you think it's weird that 15 billionaires own every news outlet that we read. There's something weird with that.
Well, it's like 15 billionaires and like how many other people? Like there's like 15 billionaires and I think it's like 16 corporations or something like that, right?
I mean, those are just owned by other billionaires that are part of that 15 billionaires. They're all the same people.
Well, that's fair.
They all hang out together.
Yeah.
And go to fancy dinner parties.
Yeah.
And the scientists never get involved because they never get invited to those fancy dinner parties. And then they invent a contraption that makes everyone jump slightly to the left.
Oh, and it's actually 15 billionaires and 6 corporations. I said 16, but it's 6. Yeah.
I was just making a reference to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Oh. I love that movie. I've always wanted to read the book. I've just never gotten that far.
Man, there's 6 books to it?
Yeah. It doesn't surprise me. So, though I do love Dirk Gently's holistic detective agency.
Yeah, that's pretty funny too.
Yeah. But like AT&T, Comcast, the Walt Disney Company, National Amusements, which includes Viacom and CBS, the News Corp and Fox Corporation, which are both owned by the Murdochs, Sony and Hearst Communications are the major corporations that own modern media.
There's 5 books.
Is there? Good. So, like, I don't know. Like, so we have to kind of consider, though, too, like that until the start of the 20th century, like newspapers, they kind of held the monopoly on community news, right?
Right.
And they really thrived after World War II. By the 1950s, like you had all these different families, right? Or wealthy individuals. They kind of owned all these local newspapers, right? And the local newspaper was handed down from like generation to generation of generation. Mm-hmm. At its peak, they all kind of became local monopolies, I guess you could say, right? Because like, let's say that you live in, I need a generic name. Well, New York's a little bit big, but like
Chicago.
Let's say you lived in Syracuse. Okay.
Wait, what?
Syracuse. It's in New York.
Okay.
Yeah. It's like a mid-sized city, something like that.
Is it bigger than Buffalo?
I don't know. I've only been to Buffalo once and I hated their airport, so.
All right, so some small town in New York, Syracuse.
Yeah, I mean, it's, mid-sized city sort of thing. But like, are you going to trust Buffalo's news? Because like Syracuse and Buffalo, they're not too far away, by the way. Syracuse distance to Buffalo, by the way, is like, I don't know, like 150 miles away or something like that, right? And Buffalo and Niagara Falls, they're not too far away either. Rochester falls in about the middle.
But I would basically believe the bigger cities news other than a small town cities news.
But if you live in the small town, right?
Yeah.
And that's all that you've ever known your whole life, you don't move away, because it's kind of how this works generally, is like in general, you tend to live around where you've always grown up. Now, you and I are a little bit different in that respect because, like, I live an hour away from where I grew up, but you live like 8 hours away from where you grew up, right?
Yeah.
But we're kind of the minority in that because, like, we never necessarily felt an attachment to those places, right?
Right.
But for the people who did feel an attachment, they probably want to be involved in whatever's going on locally,
Mhm.
right? So if you found out that, well, some natural disaster like a tornado affected your hometown, right? And 3 months later, you just want to hear the local news regarding how are we rebuilding from that or what's going on. Like, I'm out of work because my factory was destroyed. Like, you would rely on the local newspaper to be able to tell you those things.
Yeah.
So they kind of have a monopoly over what's going on right in front of you, if that makes sense.
It does make
At least,
sense.
and so most of them, like most of these newspaper companies, that's how they always existed, right? Like in 1953, 1,300 newspapers were owned by independent publishers. And by 1980, the number of independent publishers went down to about 700 because all these companies started realizing that, hey, it might make sense for us to buy up these local newspapers because, like, people are curious about the news.
Hmm.
So why don't we move in on their terrain, buy up these local companies, let them kind of do things the way that they were doing it, but we'll handle the business aspects of it. They can focus on the journalism and we'll focus on the costs.
I mean, that makes sense. I mean, a small town news organization, they probably don't have the funds that a larger news organization has. So them able to still doing their small town news the way they always have been, but maybe having a larger one control the finances, so maybe they can have a larger spread in just the local news. Yeah, that seems fine. I don't see anything that could probably go wrong.
Well, I mean,
something went wrong, didn't
they
it?
just became, yeah. Well, I mean, eventually, like these bigger corporations, they just kind of realized, hey, you know what? These smaller companies, like, nobody would bat an eye at them, but like, they're making a lot of money. So if we can convince them to go public, right, we can buy a bunch of shares and we can kind of skim off of that. Or they just buy them outright and now all of a sudden they have their own money mill, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of the trend that you notice from about 1970, somewhere in the 1970s through the 1990s, is these bigger companies just sweeping in, buying up these smaller publications and even sometimes larger publications, right? And then like they'll invest in better printer press technology, right? Because I mean, I'm sure that you remember that the comics were originally in black and white, but then eventually they ended up in color, sort of thing.
They had red all over.
Yeah. I mean, there was a lot of technology for them to invest in. But eventually with the dawn of the internet, like these companies, I don't want to say they went away, but they had to find new ways to adapt or they went away. So a lot of them shifted to like, hey, well, $2.99 a week. We'll give you a digital copy of our newspaper. No delivery fees involved. I mean, it's cheaper for them. They're just trying to survive. But eventually people started getting their news from other sources, whether that be TV, which started to become way more polarized, right? Like the amount of feudalism that you notice between different news branches, as you mentioned, the CNN article about Ron DeSantis earlier, because CNN has nothing bad to say about Republicans,
no,
right?
They don't. They're totally unbiased, like a news should be. And they only give the facts and they never say anything bad.
Well, the funny thing is, like, from about like the 40s to about the 1960s, the news really tried to remain unbiased because they're like, no, this is what people are reaching out to us for.
Right.
This is why they, but somewhere in the 70s with the advent of like CNN and these more polarizing news networks and these new mediums of capturing people, right? Mm-hmm. Like as an example, I remember growing up and my dad would listen to Rush Limbaugh every
geez.
weekend. Yeah. So, and my dad's a chill dude, don't get me wrong, but like he was just curious on what his take was on things. But that's not the experience that most people have when they listen to Rush Limbaugh. Most people, when they listen to Rush Limbaugh, right, they're um,
That's
a little bit biased. Like
yeah.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that people kind of seek out the news that fits what they think.
Right.
Because all of a sudden there are more options. I mean, like cable TV was invented in I think the 1960s, right? And as a result, like you had a bunch more options than what you had previously, and you'd find news that kind of fit how you thought.
Mm-hmm. And that makes sense. I mean, you kind of want that confirmation of what your idea is and kind of have that confirmation bias. I mean, that's totally a thing. I mean, I can totally understand why someone would only want to hear what they're thinking so they can be reaffirmed that they're right. Because no one wants to be
But
wrong,
that's just
and no one wants to think that they're wrong.
I mean, I'm fine with
yeah.
The thing is, like, I'm fine with being wrong.
Yeah.
You're fine with being wrong.
Right. I'm just
everybody fucks up. I was wrong once before, but I was mistaken, right?
Yeah. It's interesting that I mean, it's interesting that your dad would listen to Rush Limbaugh just to see his take on it. I'm sure people thought that Rush Limbaugh was just a smart guy and knew what he was talking about, and that he wasn't biased at all or had to push his own agenda. But to see other people's, I mean, if you were watching Fox News just to see what the other side was saying about an issue, and then just kind of meeting somewhere in the middle between CNN and Fox News. But for the most part, you're going to get the same facts on the situation, but you're going to have a weird, I mean, like we mentioned in the previous episode, you're going to have this weird reasons why something is happening rather than just the facts. So when Fox News is talking about one situation and CNN is talking about the same situation, and they're covering the same facts, they're going to have a different reasons why that's happening.
Right. It's almost like listening to two entirely different stories, and you wouldn't even realize it unless you were paying close attention that they were talking about the same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Like recently, I hear a lot from the right about how the Dems are trying to overtake everything and this and that. And on the left, I hear like, I don't actually hear a lot on the left. I mostly just talk to people on the right. That's kind of a sad fact in my life. And I'm just over here like sighing, like, but I guess my point of contention remains the same though. Like, whatever you're around, I don't know. Whatever you're around, you tend to be influenced by that.
Yeah.
And then after becoming influenced by that, you tend to try to find either ways to refute that, or if you like the idea, then ways to go along with that.
Right.
Now, in my instance, I'm typically using ways to refute that because I can already see the bias in certain people's arguments. I just don't feel like arguing. But
I mean, that's fair.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of like, I mean, at some point, let's say Fox News and CNN were unbiased, so they tend to just watch CNN for whatever reason because CNN was unbiased, they're getting good news, and then over time they might not have realized that CNN is pushing their own agenda, and so over time they're now slowly adopting the CNN perspective, and now they're only going to go with CNN's idea of what's right and wrong, or their personal agendas on why things are happening. I mean, I could see that.
I typically agree with this guy, so therefore I'm going to continue agreeing with him even when I'm unsure because he's typically in line with what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I could totally see that happening for someone if they're watching a certain news program over 20 years and not differentiating between another news channel, and then just slowly not It's almost like they're grooming people into their own ideals, but it's not really grooming because it's just news.
Well, even then, like as an example, Fox News has fallen out of favor with the far right, right? Whereas most of them, I shouldn't say most of them, a lot of them seem to prefer Newsmax now, which whatever. I've never listened to anything on Newsmax, so I have no idea what it is, but it can't be worse than InfoWars, where apparently like we're talking about turning the frogs gay. So, which I mean, he once again, like there was a shred of news in that where it's like this chemical company was dumping things into the water and it was actually causing the frogs to do weird things,
Yeah.
right? There was a shred of evidence to that. But at the same token, like Alex Jones is just nuts. Like he's extremist and he's like taking things like way too far. It's like, yeah, we shouldn't be dumping chemicals. You're absolutely right about that. Why did this need to be a 45-minute segment about turning frogs gay? Like, hey, I don't care if a frog's gay or not. As far as chemical exposure goes, like that's pretty low on my list of shit to care about. Like, you know what I mean?
Right. You care about the toxins being poured into a lake or a pond or whatever. That's the important part.
Right. Right. Yeah, it shouldn't happen.
There's a cause and
Like,
effect.
you know what?
And you're putting too
Right.
much emphasis on the effect rather than why it happened.
Well, I mean, like, yeah, it's exactly that. Yeah.
Why are you so mad at the frogs and not the chemicals? I mean,
Right. Yeah.
what if those
Why is
chemicals
it
are in
that
your
the frog?
cereal?
Right. Well, I mean, it probably just disagrees with his traditional Judeo-Christian values, even though he's saying fuck or shit all the time. Like, you know, whatever. Like, choose and censor how you want, I guess. But, like, the worst part is, do you know where I first heard about InfoWars?
Was it at work?
No.
Oh, where?
No. On Facebook.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. And there was a pretty big debate. I don't even remember what the topic was about, but like people were like at each other's throats about it. And I'm like, I don't even recognize InfoWars as like a good source.
No.
Like,
Yeah.
like this was like when they were first coming off. It was like one of my Marine friends, and he's like, "Oh, didn't you hear about this?" And I'm like, why the fuck do I care? Like, you know what I mean? Like,
It's like if I only got my news from Facebook
mm-hmm.
or one subreddit.
Oh dear God, yeah.
Like
and of course it's the MAGA subreddit,
yeah,
right?
I only get my news from Democrats are I only get my news from Pizzagate, actually. I only follow that subreddit Pizzagate, and that's how I get all of my news. So
is it good news or is it cheesy?
That's it. That's right.
It might be saucy content.
And people should definitely be more aware of where they're getting their news from. But like if you just don't know, like you could just get caught in that trap of like, oh yeah, I'm listening to this news source and it sounds great. And I guess now this is real. But
well, it comes back to that self-confirming bias, right?
yeah.
And I think that a lot of that has to do with like as soon as you find somebody who agrees with you, you get a small dopamine hit just like that,
Mhm.
right? And it's like, while I understand that, emotions are not an appeal to logic. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes, it does.
But so many people just throw up like instantaneous fisticuffs over like, you know what I'm saying? Like you go on some Reddit subforums and they're like, a woman should not be portraying herself like that. And it's like, you watch a ton of porn, Dad.
Yeah. And that's the problem with the news nowadays.
Well, the problem is that it's actually shifted to just becoming, we trust what people with like-minded ideals tell us to trust.
Yeah.
And that's not all right, man.
No.
Like, we've become so lazy with fact checking because the century of Walter Cronkite's was always there for us, but now it's gone.
And that was like my issue with, I mean, that's when I first brought up the issue of like people just don't fact check anymore. And they just believe whatever they first read or first hear from what they think are reputable news sources. And maybe they are reputable news sources. I mean, I'm not saying CNN and Fox News or I am saying
No.
InfoWars is not a reputable news source, but I also I don't even know if they're on the news. I don't think they're broadcasting anymore.
They're not a local. Well, I mean, it's not like they're on satellite TV or anything like that. I think you literally have to pay a subscription online to watch them,
Yeah.
which that should be your first key indicator that probably not a reputable news source. If somebody's trying to scam you out of money so that way you subscribe to their content online, chances are that they're not a reputable news source. By the way, we have a Patreon page.
Also, New York Times and New York Post and all these articles that you read online, they also have a subscription.
Yeah.
But also Alex Jones was sued, and I don't know if he's actually going to be podcasting anymore.
I kind of doubt it. Yeah. Like that lawsuit seemed pretty so that's the thing, like going back to that, like even Fox News, man, like
oh yeah, they were sued too.
Yeah, Tucker Carlson got kicked off the air because they were like, "Well, we don't want to have anything to do with you anymore." like
they loved,
you know what I mean?
Carl Tuckerson brought them so much money too. Like he was like their most viewed asset.
He was the fanboy.
Yeah, everyone loved him. But as soon as it started costing them money, they're like, "I'm out. Peace. Get out."
Yeah. And I mean, I guess in all of this, I mean, we have to wonder exactly where that sort of feudalism started. That sort of, that sort of I'm right versus you're right sort of mentality, or I'm right, you're wrong,
right?
Versus, like, and I mean, I really think it's. The issue that I guess I have, and I guess it's sort of some cognitive dissonance in there, right? Is that like it probably all started from having different media choices, right? So like CNN became a thing and Fox News became a thing, and it kind of polarized people to one side or the other. And then all these other news broadcasters realized, oh, well, this sort of sensationalism or yellow journalism is really just bringing in more revenue.
Right. It all comes down to what's getting the most views. How do I get the most people watching my news to get the most ad revenue, to get the most money?
Yeah.
That's all it comes down to.
And I mean, marketing does the same thing, though.
It does.
Right? And
yep.
I mean, like, you realize that by fragmenting your audience, and when I say that, I mean, like, this product is not going to appeal to everybody, but I will target the people who it does appeal to.
Yeah.
So in this instance, let's take. You got a good made-up product? I have one, but it's lewd.
A made-up product? I don't know. I mean, Alex Jones was always trying to sell brain supplements to make you smarter, and
okay, we can go with that. So I have these brain supplements, right? Clinical evidence has shown that chamomile will calm you down, and if you are going to be a rational thinker, then you need to calm down. Nothing is worth getting this upset about. Nothing. So we have fused that with lavender, which historically through the 1800s, and now you can look this up, by the way, medications from the 1800s, right? They almost always include lavender. They don't actually almost always include lavender. No. But moving forward, now this is a holistic approach. Now the doctors are going to tell you that they've done clinical trials on their so-called medications.
But those same doctors were doing the experiments on people to give them terrible diseases, and they turned into gay frogs.
Yeah, but that's what led us to scientific revolution. Stay with it. Like, so
You
do
can't.
you understand
Yeah.
how that's not going to appeal to most people?
No.
Okay, that doesn't appeal to me at all. like me saying that, I almost well, actually I did cringe a couple of times. And I had
I
to
don't. I don't
stop,
know
but
how Alex Jones sold all his brain medication, no, his brain
because he
pills
doesn't care.
to
He
people.
doesn't care about the actual authentic well-being of people.
Yeah,
He
but
just wants to make
the
money.
people believed him. That's
I
the
don't doubt
surprising
it.
part.
The thing is that they only believed him because he was so passionate about what he did.
That's true.
Because if you were that angry constantly, somebody would be like, oh shit, this is a reason for me to get riled up about. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like in that little bit there that I did, like there was no logic whatsoever, right? Like 1800s, going back to the 1800s, there's nothing there. Like it was all patent medicine. We established that before. Like all that stuff that
Snake oil
Pirelli's
medicine.
Pirelli's miracle elixir, which Link and the Doobly do.
Now made with more mercury.
Oh, I hope so. I like mercury.
It's good for
It made the Mad Hatter matter.
It's good for the heart. Get your blood going.
It is not good for the heart. As an ex-nurse, I cannot suggest that you take mercury ethically at all. Like, that's a bad idea. In every instance, like somebody's like, well, it's not for this instance. There's no medication currently that I can think of that uses mercury.
But Alex Jones told me that his brain pills made with more mercury than the 1.0 batch.
Yeah. Alex Jones can also pound salt. I don't really give a shit. Like,
I think
it's just Jones,
I don't know. Like,
you think he's great?
No, I think he deserved his lawsuit where he lost billions of dollars because he was convincing everyone that like I think it was like a weird school shooting that he was just saying
Uvalde.
that it was fake and it was all actors portraying it.
Yeah, it was the Uvalde school shooting. Yeah. We actually just hit a year not too long ago with that.
And then he just convinced all his like listeners that it was a hoax and they need to look at the evidence, and then he got sued and lost billions. It's definitely not
because his evidence was bad.
Yeah, it's definitely not like Fox getting sued by Dominion for saying that the election was stolen and everything was fraud, and it definitely has no relation anything like that where you can just spout lies and not be sued and lose.
I mean, I get all my news off of Twitter. So like, you know, Twitter was full of it too, but they're unbiased.
Yeah, well, luckily Twitter,
Elon made sure.
Yeah, luckily Elon Musk is the new savior and everyone loves him and he's doing great because he's a self-made billionaire and he's just trying to save the world with his rockets and cars and free speech.
His free speech, unless it's against like Twitter.
Yeah. Which has nothing, no comparison to the Palmer reigns where.
no, nothing to do with that. Yeah, no, it's not like we got any sort of animosity from this, but seriously, don't talk bad about Twitter. Otherwise, we will suspend your account.
Yeah,
and we can't give you.
Yeah, and also don't talk bad about America because you'll get arrested for being a communist.
And also, these verified blue badges, they're completely voluntary. You don't have to do it. But once you have so many followers, it's not volunteers. Yeah, once you have so many followers, you have to do it though.
At least people don't get arrested for being a communist anymore.
I mean,
I hope not. You know, I actually didn't fact check that.
They still,
I'm just assuming
they still use this law. By the way, the espionage law, they definitely still use that. So let me just Google real quick. Recent uses of the Espionage Act.
I'm just glad that a lot of the communist hate is now just anti-Russia and anti-China, which is weird because Trump was trying to do so many trades with China and Russia.
And, well, I mean, he involved Russia in the campaign. Like, it's not... Okay. So an old piece of this is from USA Today. An old piece of anti-spy legislation is back in the headlines after FBI searched former Donald President's Mar-a-Lago residence for classified materials they believe he took from the White House.
Does that fall under the espionage thing?
The FBI has cited violations of the Espionage Act as a catalyst for its documentation seizure and reported uncovering materials marked top secret / SCI.
Whoa.
Among them was a grant of clemency for famed Trump associate Roger Stone. So, yeah, it was literally just used 100 years later. Literally, almost exactly 100 years later. Like, when was this article written? So 2022, the Espionage Act was in 1918, or maybe it was 1917. It was 1917. But literally 105 years later, they use this against a president.
Yep. Well, luckily,
Excellent work.
Trump's doing great right now, and he's not being sued by anyone or any kind of big lawsuits.
I don't know. His followers on social media seem to think this is all a hoax, which, like, every president, by the way, like, okay, so this is just going with my own reporting style, by the way, but every president, after they get out of office, has to have classified documents that they're unaware of.
Probably.
I'm just to go after a president because you just don't like him. That's a dangerous precedent to set. You see what I'm saying there? Because when Biden gets out of office, is he going to be sued? Like, okay, so A, I think the dude has Alzheimer's and doesn't have a clue what he's doing. But that said, like, he doesn't have a clue what he's doing. Does that necessarily violate, like, if he misplaces some documents?
Yeah.
Are the Republicans going to go after him? It's like,
probably. I mean, they're definitely most likely going to try and do everything they can to go after him. I think it's slightly different just because Trump took them when he was done being president.
Well, I mean, I'm not advocating for the dude.
That reason for New York. He's being sued for other reasons.
Yeah, I mean, that was just a news article that popped up. And I'm not advocating for the dude because I don't like the dude. But simultaneously, like, that we have entered a dangerous era of fragmentation between audiences.
Right.
I guess that's the best way to put it.
And Trump is actually a good example of, like, what for modern news and how news is being spread, because everyone was looking at Fox News and CNN for news, and then Trump would say on Twitter that everything is fake news and everyone's trying to go against him. So he was using his own social media to push his own news to invalidate every other news around him.
Well, and the funny thing is, do you remember InfoWars?
Yeah.
So guess what president endorsed InfoWars at one point in time?
Obama.
Got it good.
Was it Trump?
It was definitely Trump.
Makes sense.
No, I don't remember. I can't find the quote right now.
I think that's actually what pushed InfoWars to become more mainstream.
Yeah. Well, it was really dominant within some people in the military.
Yeah.
Not all people in the military, but just some people in the military. It really started circulating there.
Yeah.
So, like, my wife was in the Navy, and, like, you know, she saw that firsthand, and she's like, yeah, dude, I don't drink the Kool-Aid, so, like, I'm gonna stay over here if that's all right. Like, you know,
it's funny because Alex Jones didn't like Trump. Like, he was betting against him.
Yeah.
And then he was pushed by Trump, and then he changed sides because of money.
Yeah. Well, I mean, or just the fact that he wasn't right, and he's like, well, whatever.
Yeah.
I can make this work for me. I can make this work for my business. So,
he had a pivot.
Like, we have a Mac code. Like, so I don't So I work as a diesel engineer, and we have a Matco tool guy who comes about every week who likes to spread the gospel of the right wing.
That's nice of him.
Yeah.
Do you have a Snap-on truck that spreads the gospel of the left wing? That'd be really funny.
No, he just doesn't. He just doesn't spread the gospel
The Snap-on guy or
of
the
any
Matco guy?
party. The Snap-on
I didn't know you
guy.
had both Matco and Snap-on show up.
Yeah, we're fancy. Most shops do.
But the Matco guy, he
yeah.
spreads the gospel of the right wing.
Yes, and he likes to explain about how he has no money because nobody will buy anything. And then I ask him for a 10 millimeter wrench, and he quotes me $70 for it, and I say hard pass, and then he's like, "Well, that's the best I can do. Times are tough," and it's like, I get it. I mean, and this is an extreme example because I did ask him for a $10 wrench, but I think it was only $45.
But that's still a lot for a 10 millimeter
for
wrench.
a 10 millimeter wrench.
You can buy like 30 of them.
Well, I told him I could buy a set of Huskies for that. I just lost my 10 millimeter. And he's like, well, you might have luck in the used bin. And I'm like, for a 10 millimeter? Nah. So, like, I mean, and I get that he has to make money too, but he doesn't offer any incentives to buy from him. Last time I went to him with a warranty claim, as an example, he's like, oh, you broke it. And I'm like, it was broke when I got it. No, I can see here that you did something to it. It was like a $40, $50 rivet gun.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, I'm not even going to fuck with it. Like, you want to argue this, I'm fine with this. But you lost my business as a result. And now he comes around saying that it's all the Democrats' fault because he's not getting business.
At least the Snap-on guy's nice.
Yeah, he's chill. Yeah, Mark's a good guy.
He knows his products are overpriced.
Yeah,
but he's just trying to make
but at the same
living.
time, well, I mean, and the worst part is like he got some sort of like friend or family member or something like that who goes out in the tool truck now while he handles like ordering things in the background. Like, he's doing all right, but he'll also give you a good deal if like you're buying something.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that like good deals, I'm not saying that even a great value proposition is necessary to make it as a business. Like, I'm not saying that at all.
Mm-hmm.
All I'm saying is that like the left is not responsible for your problems, but neither is the right. Neither side is responsible for your problems. Your problems are your own doing. And I would have thought that accountability would have sank in at some point, but
I feel like the right is not making our economy any better.
They're probably not, but neither is the left.
No, they're not.
Yeah, everybody's kind of fucking you all over the place.
Bit.
So, like, by polarizing yourself, it's like, and I'm all for like social reform,
mm-hmm.
right? I get that that's largely needed over here. And I'm certainly not suggesting that I'm right because I'm certainly not always right.
Yeah. Have you been keeping up on the debt ceiling rising?
I've been ignoring it. It seems like a pissing match where Biden wants to throw out his tiny dick, but so does McCarthy. So, and meanwhile, you have common sense there in the middle with its big swinging dick, like pissing on both of them. Like, just do something.
Yeah. From what I've been reading from my news sources.
Is it social media?
It is social media. Mostly, let's see. I follow some people on Instagram and they talk about it, and then I follow some. I don't really follow anything on Reddit, but I do just read what they're trying to push, and I'm not fact checking it because I'm a good citizen, and I only believe what I read, and I'm sure the truth is somewhere in the middle, where the Republicans are not wanting to raise the debt ceiling, but the left wants to raise the debt ceiling, and they said they'll only raise the debt ceiling if we cut Medicare and social programs, even though the debt ceiling is an issue brought from Trump and tax cuts from corporations and the wealthy, which made it so the government was getting less money because of those tax cuts, which made it so we could.
But you didn't fact check?
No, I'm not fact checking this.
Oh,
Chat
okay.
GPT isn't updated for 2023 yet, so I'll get this.
No.
I'll fact check it in like 2 years.
That's a good point. You probably should wait.
Yeah.
You know,
But
the evidence will become larger at that point.
I'm sure the truth is somewhere in the middle with that whole fiasco of, yeah, we're gonna the Republicans want to do tax cuts for wealthy corporations and the wealthy 10%, 1%, and so now the government's getting less money in taxes from people, and now we can't pay our debt because it's getting less money because of those tax cuts, and now they want to cut programs to make up for that tax cuts and not getting extra money, and they want to cut Medicare, and because the right have always wanted to cut Medicare.
Did you hear what Marjorie Taylor Greene was proposing in Congress?
She's.
I feel like we should have a Marjorie Taylor Greene quote of the week, by the way.
She's something.
She's just nuts.
She's a dumpster fire.
Well, I mean, that actually attributes to just her white trash upbringing. But like moving forward from that, like she said that she was going to put legislation in some act. I don't even remember what, that banned porn. And I was just like, you know, the right wing is going to get more upset about that than the left wing, right? Like the right wing can cling to their morals and their bootstraps and all that stuff. But I know a lot of right wing people who are into some real weird porn. And don't ask how I know that. Well, I actually do ask. I ask them because like whenever I get uncomfortable in an argument, that's the easiest thing to like balance the tables. It's like, okay, so what type of porn are you into? And I just say it so nonchalantly and I stare them in the eyes. It's a really weird tactic on my part. I'll give you that, but I'm weird in general. Like, but it works really well because people get really kind of like insecure really quick. And then I just sit there with like this judgmental face, like, okay. But anyhow, weirdly enough, I get answers more often than not.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. I would just make something up.
Well, I mean, maybe that's what they do.
Maybe. So, but maybe they're just not witty enough and they just actually tell the truth. They're in the furries.
Yeah, or maybe they tell the truth. Yeah, well, the worst part is I got that answer once. So, yeah, Mako Tool guy, you're weird.
I was at work at the factory, and I made a furry joke, and he's like, what's that? And I'm like, Google it. And he Googled furry stuff.
Was he happy?
No, he's like, this is weird.
Yeah. And
I'm like, you know.
Dumpster fire.
To each their own.
Yeah. All right, man. I think we should wrap up.
Oh, man.
We've gotten too weird this segment.
I don't know. I mean, we made a good point about social media becoming the new news outlet since I get all my news from social media. Because why would I watch TV for news? That stuff's biased and doesn't give all the facts. But social media,
a good point,
though,
Aaron.
I guess only the true facts and it's totally unbiased in every regard. But I'm also I've always been under the impression. I've always been skeptical of pretty much anything that I hear, and even with like the ceiling, the debt ceiling, like there's just so much going on with it, and also it's kind of like the government's going to be able to pay for what they want. Like I was reading about an economist. Where it's like if they raise the debt ceiling, it's not going to matter. They're going to be able to pay what they need to, and if it doesn't get paid, they still have to pay what they need to. You know, they need to pay their debt.
They act like there's like this really strict deadline, right? And I mean, I'm sure that there is a strict deadline, but I'm also sure that like just like with my library fines, there's a couple days there where like, you know what I'm saying? Where if you tell somebody, hold up. You know what I mean?
It just seems like it's this weird. It just seems like it's too complicated for the average, and that's kind of like what's going on with the news too. Is like some stuff is just too complicated to actually like get out and talk about in like a 15-minute segment. Like we can't just talk about the
Yeah.
debt ceiling and everything that goes on with it in 15 minutes. I mean,
No,
and most of our
no,
congressmen and senate and politicians, like they're too dumb to actually know what a debt ceiling is and how money works.
Yeah.
They just,
right. Well, I mean, they're elected officials, but they're not elected based on like an IQ test or anything
No.
like that. You know what I mean?
just
Like they're elected by charismatics and how much their opinions align.
and that's
with
a whole
yours
other issue
or whatever. Yeah,
like,
I know.
is that, I mean, when I get a job, I have to at least have like some experience with it. But if like I want to be a
You
politician,
have to have an interview.
like I literally have to have no experience, and I could just be a politician.
You just need competence. Though in my neighborhood, there was like this bartender from Lakewood who said that changes need to happen. And he got like, I assume, a bunch of his bar cronies to sign a petition. So that way he could be running, or not a petition. You need so many signatures to run for a House of Representatives thing, right? But like the congressman who is running, they're great. Like there's no reason that I need to go with some radical, like left wing, like whatever. The congressman who I voted for, they've had a great track record. So like you going over there saying times need to change, that doesn't mean shit to me. I don't care if times, I mean, they do need to change.
Yeah.
I'm not arguing with that. But like you're arguing with somebody who historically has had a really good track record for like social situation, or, you know, how do I want to put it? Social programs, I guess is the best way to put it. Like, because after all, as we established, the only reason to like be a part of a government is if the government's helping you in some way, and then you can help the government in some way. So healthcare, that makes sense. Like these sorts of social, how do I want to put it? There's a word for it. I just can't remember it right now. But these sort of social programs, they exist for a reason. And just like you don't like paying $200 for healthcare a month, or $300 or $400, I don't like paying that either. And that seems like the medical system should help the people, if that makes sense, as opposed to us fighting insurance companies so that way we can actually have some treatment, which we all avoid because it costs too much money.
Yep. Definitely.
Too much for a different day.
Yeah. I mean, our whole medical system is not flawed in any way, and I'm glad it works perfectly. And I'm glad everyone gets the help they need for free.
Yeah, me too. So I will leave you with a quote from Donald Trump and the amazing Alex Jones. I can't find it. Sandy Hook. That's all I got.
Oh, yeah, Sandy Hook. Well, if you enjoyed this episode, then you can listen to our other episodes wherever you found this episode. Also, if you like supporting the channel, you can tell your friends, and you can check out our Patreon. And next week,
please do.
Next week, we'll probably talk about social media, because everyone gets their news from social media now. Even Fox is on social media.
Yeah,
that's quite the.
Well, agreed.
That's quite something.
And just remember, the globalist Humpty Dumpty has had a great fall, and all propagandists and all the New World Order stooges and all the media whores can't put him back together again.